Good morning and welcome to The Point. This week, we sat down with the leader of the House Democrats. They're in the minority, but they're in an interesting position. If the situation between Representative Todd Courser and Representative Cindy Gamrat moves forward and moves towards expulsion, and nobody is saying it's going to, but if it does, it will take Democratic votes to remove them from office. This morning, we spend the first part of our program talking about the Courser-Gamrat affair with State Representative and leader of House Democrats, Tim Greimel. I want to start with what this town has been talking about, frankly, for months, but for the past few weeks since it became a more broadly known news story. And I'm not as concerned about the facts that we don't completely know yet. But obviously with Representative Courser and Representative Gamrat, there has been a good deal of focus on that. The internal investigation by the House Business Office with a report that we'll get to in a minute. Can you just give me a sense what that's done to the ability of this body to focus on the matters at hand? I realize you haven't had many session days, and that was already scheduled, but how much of the consciousness has this absorbed? Yeah,
it certainly is an unfortunate distraction right now. The whole thing is unfortunate in a lot of ways. It's unfortunate for the dignity of the House. It's unfortunate for taxpayers because of these allegations of misuse of public resources. And it's very unfortunate for the children of the representatives directly involved. It must be a very difficult time for the families. But it's also very unfortunate in that it is a distraction. And I think most people in the state understand that this is not where we need to be focused. We need to focus on making sure that we're getting the work of the state done. Most importantly, getting roads done.
When something like this happens, it is relatively rare, but there are occasions of either misconduct or missteps. And again, I don't want to get too far into the weeds on exactly what this is until it's had a full hearing. But what does it do to members who are here, the other 107, 108, however many are currently serving, who are trying to get things done, who are trying to keep their eye on the ball, if you were, and yet this kind of attention that gets an inordinate amount of attention compared to some of the other things you might be working on. What does it do to the spirit of the folks that are trying to serve in the House when you see this big onslaught of media that comes in to cover this when they probably should be looking over here?
Well, it's a very good point. A lot of the distraction around the whole Courser-Gamrat debacle is because of the increased media attention there. We get a lot of questions from the media about that. We get some questions from constituents about that as well. And there are some very serious issues there. Don't misunderstand me. Certainly the allegations of misuse of public funds and the possibility that employees were fired when they refused to go along with the misuse of public resources is a very serious issue that needs to be investigated. But at the same time, there are other very important issues, including, as I said, making sure we get the roads fixed. That's long past due. And there are a lot of other important issues on the horizon, including updating the state's energy policy. And so I do think some people here think, it's fine to have a lot of media attention on the Courser-Gamrat issues, especially some of these important issues about misuse of public funds, but we should have as much or more media attention on issues like fixing the roads and updating the state's energy policy and investing more in education. Those are the issues that in the long term are going to impact everyday people's everyday lives.
I will say quite candidly that I don't know exactly what was done in that office, and until we see the report, a report that is, as we are sitting here, has not been released, and we'll talk about that in a moment. No. But you, from a legal background, have a much better idea than do I. Does it matter in the case if one or the other or both of these representatives were misusing state funds? Does the amount matter? And I ask that because of this. They themselves would not have had access to a pile of cash, for example. They would have been able to misuse perhaps their staff for things. Yeah. They've only been in office for 7 months. Sure. So it isn't like they've misused millions of dollars in state funds. That's just not practical. But does it matter? Does the dollar figure matter?
Well, that's a very good question. I think any misuse of public funds or public resources, including staff time, that is to say, taxpayer-funded staff using time during the workday, 9 to 5, to engage in what is alleged to have occurred here, which is a cover-up, is a very serious allegation. I wouldn't say that the amount is completely irrelevant, but I think any amount of misuse of public resources is a very serious issue. As I've said before, that needs to be investigated. The House Business Office has completed an investigation that has not been released publicly yet, or for that matter to my office yet. And we believe that the public has a right to know whether or not a misuse of public resources has occurred, and if so, who's responsible. So we have called the Speaker's office to immediately publicly release that information. But in addition, we also believe that we need to make sure that a law enforcement agency with subpoena power is investigating, because the House Business Office does not have subpoena power. It cannot require people to tell the truth under the penalty of perjury. And if we want to get to the bottom of what occurred here, we need an entity with subpoena power that can compel people to testify under oath. And a law enforcement agency has the expertise needed to do that. That's why we've asked for the Attorney General to investigate. Apparently the Michigan State Police are looking into at least one aspect of this, but we'll have to see exactly how broad their scope of investigation is.
Going back to the misuse of staff for a minute, and I want to make it clear that staffers very often are used for campaign and other duties when off the clock. It is not unusual for someone who is employed as a staffer for a representative, maybe not even for that representative, to campaign for another representative on their own time, away from the Capitol, and as I said, off the clock. I mean, because there are a lot of political animals that live within the building.
Sure.
So I want to make that distinction, because somebody will say, well, I saw such and such that worked for Representative X that was passing out literature.
Yeah.
That is okay, but you've got to keep a close record of those hours and make sure that it's done separate from your duties as a state employee.
Well, that's exactly right. And importantly, it's got to be done on a volunteer basis. That is to say, it's got to be because that individual staff person feels very passionate about an issue, wants to be supportive of a cause or a candidate, and decides voluntarily that they want to volunteer their time outside of their work hours. It cannot be a situation where their employer says, you've got to volunteer outside of hours, or you've got to do this outside of hours in order to support campaigns, or else we won't employ you from your taxpayer-funded job. That would be illegal. So again, it's true that a lot of staff volunteer outside their taxpayer-funded time, and that's fine, but it's got to be voluntary on their own part.
Now to the report. You've already alluded to it. The report from the House Business Office has been completed. It has been delivered just across the hall to the Speaker's office. You say you haven't seen it. I certainly haven't seen it. The Speaker's office says that they might release portions of or a summary of that report. Let me ask you this. Is there a case to be made that if this goes to the Attorney General or some other office that you were talking about that has subpoena power, is there a case to be made that that report should not be laid completely open if there's going to be a criminal prosecution or at least a criminal investigation?
Well, it's an interesting question. The first question is, are law enforcement agencies investigating the whole scope here? We have called for them to do so, but the Attorney General's office, for example, has not done so. Again, there are very serious criminal allegations here. Certainly the allegation on the part of employees that they were asked to misuse their publicly financed time to cover up an affair, and that they were fired for refusing to do so, is very serious. Representative Courser has made counter allegations that are very serious criminal allegations. He has said that he's been blackmailed. He has accused the Speaker's office of eavesdropping on him or bugging his office. Now, obviously, Representative Courser doesn't have a lot of credibility at this point, But those are very serious allegations that deserve to be investigated, and that's why we believe that a law enforcement agency with subpoena power to compel people to tell the truth needs to get involved. In terms of the House Business Office report, I can understand potentially the argument that it shouldn't be released because there might be a law enforcement investigation, but I haven't actually heard the Speaker's office say that that's why they don't want to release the whole thing. And I think whenever you have an office or an elected official who is willing to release some but not all of a report, it raises the question, are they trying to selectively release parts to shape public opinion in a specific direction? And here, where there are allegations and then counter allegations against the Speaker's office, I think that's a very real risk and danger. And I think, again, the public has a right to know whether public funds and public resources were misused, and if so, who is responsible and how are they going to be held accountable. And so I would argue that the interest of the public in transparency in terms of releasing this House Business Office report really trumps any other concerns.
I've got 2 more questions, and then I'd like to move on to the things I think are more important that are going on in this state. But first, if the Speaker's office doesn't release that report, either at all or in its entirety, can the House Business Office be compelled through some legal mechanism to release that report to the pertinent official?
Yeah, it's a very good question. The House Business Office is subject to the Freedom of Information Act for some purposes in terms of finances and some of the truly business aspects of the House's operations. However, the House in general is not subject to the Freedom of Information Act.
Your office, for example, is not.
Well, that's right. And that's been the subject of a lot of debate over time. Actually, a number of Democratic representatives have introduced bills to try to change that. But regardless, right now, the Freedom of Information Act does not apply to individual offices or to other aspects of the House's operation. There might be an argument that this report relates to business or financial aspects that need to be released, but I suspect that the Speaker is going to argue that the Freedom of Information Act does not require its release.
And finally, and I appreciate this is speculative, I'm not trying to get you on the record with something, but I'm trying to get it clear in my mind, because
Sure.
in talking about this on the air over this past week, I suggested that it appears to me that there could be the direction with the new committee formation to look into the fitness of these 2 representatives serving, that sometime sooner or later, there could be a move to expel one or both of Representatives Courser and Gamrat.
Yeah.
Republicans can't do that without Democratic votes.
Sure.
Do you get any sense, and I know it's difficult because we haven't seen the report. We don't know what we know what the allegations are, we don't know what the facts are to a large degree. Have you had any conversation with your caucus about that eventuality?
We haven't yet had a lot of in-depth conversation about it, in part because we don't yet know all the facts. There have certainly been a lot of allegations made. You know, this is not about whether or not they had an affair. Certainly having affairs is wrong, but it's really just between, or should be just between, the spouses and the individuals involved. The bigger question here is not even so much whether Representative Courser concocted this really bizarre approach to trying to distract from any alleged affair. The ultimate underlying issue as it pertains to Representatives Courser and Gamrat is about whether they misused public resources to try to cover up an affair and then fired employees when they refused to go along with it. And then their counter allegations, I think, are relevant to that. So we certainly support a broad investigation into the allegations and counter allegations involved here. We think it makes sense to set up the investigatory committee to do that. We don't think that takes the place of a law enforcement agency investigation, but the two can happen side by side. I think it's really too early to jump to conclusions. Certainly, if there's a misuse of public resources and if employees were fired for refusing to go along with that, that is a very serious allegation, and the representatives involved need to be held accountable. But right now, it's unclear whether or not that was the case.
But there is much more that should be going on in Lansing, at least according to the Democratic leader. We'll talk to him about that when we come back next. To the Point. Welcome back to the Point. Well, there's been plenty of media in Lansing lately, but perhaps they haven't been focusing on exactly the right thing, at least according to State Representative and Democratic House Leader Tim Greimel. There are important things he says need to get done. Sometimes some of the other distractions just get in the way. It seems like a few years ago, it was just a few months ago, we were here. It was lame duck, and you and others were trying to find some way to put together a deal that would fix roads in the state of Michigan. And finally, we were told that deal had been reached, and the voters of the state of Michigan would get a chance to vote on it. And a few months later, they did, and they overwhelmingly rejected it. And there is still no long-term, solid financing plan for roads in the state of Michigan. You have said that this is one of the most pressing issues that the legislature needs to be working on. There are some new plans that I have heard being floated, but where are we with this? Because once again, it's going to be now past Labor Day before any substantive public talk, at least, is held about roads.
Well, I'm glad you're bringing that up. And you've been very good, by the way, Rick, about covering a broad range of substantive topics here in Lansing. You do very in-depth coverage. So you're not the kind of reporter who seems to come to town only when there's some salacious coarser gamrat thing going on, but not for other purposes. In terms of roads, this is, in my mind, by far the single most important issue that we need to address and resolve as legislators. This has been going on for years. The deteriorating roads are beating up on passenger cars throughout the state, but they're also deterring a lot of business investment in our state. This is an enormously important issue for our state's future. Voters are understandably upset that this has not been addressed. Taxpayers deserve solutions, and they deserve them now, and really they've deserved them years ago, because this has dragged on far too long. As you point out, this imperfect, to say the least, arrangement and ballot proposal was put on the ballot. Voters spoke loud and clear, and they said, this is not the route we want to go, and we want legislators to do their jobs and get the roads fixed without kicking the can down the road or putting something on the ballot. We have been having constructive conversations as the quadrant, let us say the four legislative leaders, the Republican and Democratic leader in the Senate, and the Speaker and I in the House, along with the governor. In fact, we met just earlier today, and we're going to continue to have constructive conversations. One of the big questions right now is, to what extent can general fund dollars be used to fix the roads and invest in public transportation? I think that a lot of us, including me, believe that at least some general fund dollars should be used to fix the roads, that it shouldn't just be new revenue, and that we have an obligation as representatives and elected officials more broadly to use our existing budget more wisely and find savings. The question is, how much general fund revenue is sustainable long term? And we're particularly concerned because in the Republican Speaker's plan, he wants to use $600 million of general fund dollars per year, every year into the future, without identifying where those cuts are going to come from. And we think that that's fiscally irresponsible and unsustainable long term. Either we're going to find ourselves in a situation where future elected officials are no longer willing to divert that money to roads, or they're going to do so but possibly cut public safety through reduced revenue sharing to local communities, or they're going to cut higher education or community colleges, or they're going to cut Medicaid. We have an obligation and a responsibility as elected officials to make those tough decisions now about where to cut and not kick that can down the road. And this is not a partisan concern. This is something that the governor has been very outspoken about. Governor Snyder and I agree that we need to make sure that any amount of general fund dollars used to fix roads is sustainable long term, that it won't blow a giant hole in the budget, and that we're being responsible and identifying those cuts up front.
Well, and I think the governor and you would agree on some other things. The governor has not been a big fan of eliminating the earned income tax credit to help pay for roads, and I assume that you would not be in favor of that either.
Well, that's exactly right. We've been very outspoken, and the governor has too, that the idea of paying for roads by literally increasing taxes on working poor people is the wrong approach here. Certainly everyday people, including a lot of middle-class families, have already been paying far too high taxes. All the while, we've seen massive cuts in taxes to corporations over the course of the past 4 years. Not only are we against raising taxes on the working poor, and again, these are working people we're talking about. These are not welfare recipients. These are working, low-income people. We think raising taxes on them is absolutely the wrong approach. And in fact, we'd like to see corporations pay a little bit more as part of a road funding solution. We also believe that we've got to lower the truck weights. We have got to be more responsible in how we allow these heavy trucks to beat up on our roads. We've got to do more to preserve and protect our roads long term by reducing heavy truck weights and by making sure that we have better and longer warranties for the roads so that we hold contractors accountable to fix roads right the first time.
On the warranty point, you've got a lot of agreement here within the Capitol and across, just looking out your window, you can look over at Director Seidel's office over there. But he would probably disagree with you on the weights. He has had conversations that suggest he thinks that the weight has been evenly distributed. Forgetting all of that for just a moment. $600 million in revenue out of the general fund. For those of us who follow the budget, seems like a heavy lift. You can't take $600 million. People say it's a $54 billion budget without trying to go through all the explanation. General fund comes in under $10 billion and maybe as much as $3 billion of that is set aside for matching funds and that kind of thing. So you're dealing with a relative, you're literally at $600 million, you're probably talking somewhere in the neighborhood of 10% of the disposable cash that you have in that fund, and that makes it tough, right?
Well, it makes it very tough, especially after many years of cuts. The state rightly has tightened its belt pretty considerably, and frankly, Governor Snyder deserves credit for that. But there's not a ton of fat to cut. There is still some fat, and we need to cut that, and we need to use existing resources more wisely, and I think we can do that to the tune of a couple $100 million. But when you start to get up in the range of $600 million, there's really no way to do that without having some pretty devastating effects on everyday people in the state who rely on important services, including public safety services. And you know, if we're going to go into that kind of high range, okay, well let's be adults and let's make the tough decisions now and identify where those cuts are going to come from.
If you can't get to the cuts, let's take your figure, $200 million that you might be able to get out of the general fund, and let's take the governor's figure at $1.2 billion, although some suggest it's $1.5 billion a year, but let's just say the $1.2 billion. Is there, in your mind, any legitimate way to raise $1 billion in extra revenues, be it through the hybrid that I've heard about between gas tax and registrations, or any other combination, without including what you favor, and that is raising the corporate income tax?
Well, again, we believe that those corporations that have received massive tax cuts need to pay more so that they pay their fair share to use the roadways that they, through their heavy commercial trucks, utilize as much or more than other folks. And that includes both trying to renegotiate some of these mega tax credits that are out there. Ford Motor Company was willing to come to the table and scale back some of the tax credits that they were promised because they understand that that's in the best interest of the state, it's in the best interest long-term for the business climate of the state, and that's a great example of a way that corporations can pay their fair share through cutting back on this corporate welfare and all these tax credits that have been lavished and thrown at corporations. It's been a huge problem that we see this growing burden, this growing struggle for everyday people in the state who pay higher taxes, and meanwhile the state is throwing these lavish tax credits at corporations. That's wrong and it needs to stop.
We'll be back to talk more about what happens next in the State House. To the point. So what's next in the House of Representatives concerning Courser and Gamrat? Right now we don't know. A new committee is being set up. There could be some type of rebuke. Still, resignation is a possibility, even removal, but none of that will happen quickly. As for roads, same problem. Not likely to happen quickly, but there are a lot of people pushing some new ideas that seem to be generating some optimism, but no deal yet. We'll continue to follow that through the week and every Sunday morning right here at 10 o'clock on Wood TV 8 for To the Point.